You did everything right. You studied. You showed up early. You stayed late. You said no to things your colleagues said yes to. You saved when saving hurt. You followed every rule you were ever given about money. And you are still behind. Not a little behind. Behind in a way that does not make sense when you look at the work you have put in. Behind in a way that no budget and no discipline and no sacrifice seems to fully close. And somewhere in the quiet, you have asked yourself the question that nobody around you seems to be asking. Is the game fair? Not rhetorically. Not politically. Actually, genuinely, is it fair? This video is the honest answer to that question. Not the comfortable answer. Not the political answer. Not the answer that makes everyone feel good. The honest one. There is a number that will change the way you see everything. Not your credit score. Not your salary. Not your savings rate. This number. In 2022, the average wealth of a white family in the United States reached $1.3 million. The average wealth of a black family in the same year was $211,000. A gap of more than $1 million. Between two families. In the same country. In the same economy. In the same year. And that gap, rather than closing, grew by nearly $50,000 in just 3 years. In South Africa, the numbers are even starker. For every R1 held by the typical white household, the typical black household holds 5 cents. 5 cents on the rand. Now here is what this video is not going to do. It is not going to tell you that you are a victim. It is not going to tell you that the system is so broken that nothing you do matters. It is not going to leave you with anger and no direction. What it is going to do is give you something far more valuable than either of those things. It is going to give you the truth. Because you cannot navigate terrain you cannot see. You cannot build a strategy for a race you do not understand. And you cannot stop blaming yourself for a gap that was not created by you until you understand exactly how it was created. If you have ever worked hard and still felt like you were falling behind, this video is for you. If you have ever looked at the numbers in your account and wondered what you are doing wrong, this video is for you. If you have ever felt the quiet exhaustion of trying harder than everyone around you and still arriving later, this video is for you. Chapter 1. The gap is real and it is growing. Let us start with what we know. Not what we feel. Not what we suspect. What the data actually says. The racial wealth gap is not a theory. It is not a political talking point. It is a measurement. And every major institution that has measured it has found the same thing. The gap is real. And it is growing. Between 2019 and 2022, in just 3 years, median wealth increased across the board. The economy was growing. People were building. But the racial wealth gap increased by nearly $50,000 in those same 3 years. Think about what that means. Even as both groups built, the distance between them grew. Because when you start from different places, the same rate of growth produces a larger absolute gap every single year. In South Africa, where the architecture of the gap was laid down even more deliberately, the numbers are equally clear. The richest 10% of the population own more than 85% of household wealth. And more than half of the population have more debt than assets. And the racial dimension of that inequality, more than 30 years after the end of apartheid, remains almost completely unchanged. There is no evidence, according to the World Inequality Lab, that wealth inequality has decreased since the end of apartheid. Asset allocations before 1993 still continue to shape wealth inequality today. This is not ancient history. This is the present. And the first question, the only question that matters, is why. Chapter 2. How the gap was built. To understand where a gap comes from, you have to understand how wealth is actually built. Wealth is not just money you have today. Wealth is the accumulation of everything your family was able to build, own, save and pass down across generations. It is the house your grandparents bought that you inherited or used as collateral. It is the land your great-grandparents farmed that you still own. It is the business your family built that you stepped into. It is the education that was funded, not by a loan you are still paying off, but by wealth that was already there. Now here is the critical question. What happens to every generation that was prevented, by law, by force, by policy, from building any of that? In the United States, after the Civil War, there was a moment when the gap could have been closed. 40 acres and a mule. Land redistribution. The beginning of a foundation. It was promised. It was taken back. And instead, what followed was 100 years of policy designed, not accidentally but deliberately, to prevent black wealth accumulation. Redlining. The practice of drawing lines around black neighborhoods and refusing to lend, refusing to insure, refusing to invest. Entire communities cut off from the primary engine of middle-class wealth, homeownership. Jim Crow laws. The legal architecture of separation that ensured that even where black Americans earned, they could not build, could not own, could not pass anything down. In South Africa, the mechanism was different. The outcome was identical. Under apartheid, black South Africans were prevented from living in white areas except by formal permit. Those who were permitted into white areas were concentrated in informal settlements where acquiring property wealth was legally impossible. The labor market was stratified along racial lines by law. The land was owned by a minority. The banks served the minority. And in colony after colony, across Africa, across the Caribbean, across the diaspora, the pattern was identical. Land taken. Labor extracted. Wealth built, but not for the people who built it. For the people who owned the system. This is not politics. This is architecture. And architecture, once built, does not disappear when the laws that created it are changed. It stands. And it shapes everything built on top of it. Chapter 3. Compounding works both ways. Here is the mathematics that most people never learn. When wealth grows, it compounds forward. A house bought in 1960 is worth 10 times what it was. A portfolio started in 1970 has grown at 7% per year for 50 years. Land owned in 1950 is worth 100 times its original value. Wealth compounds. Everyone who has learned even basic investing knows this. But here is what almost nobody talks about. The denial of wealth also compounds. If your grandparents were prevented from buying a home in 1955, they did not just miss the home. They missed everything that home would have become. The equity. The inheritance. The collateral for a business loan. The security that would have changed every financial decision their children ever made. The denial of one generation's wealth compounds forward into the next generation's starting point. And the next. And the next. Researchers from the National Bureau of Economic Research ran exactly this thought experiment. What if black and white Americans had started with the radically different levels of wealth that existed in 1870, but their wealth accumulation rates had been identical after that? The racial wealth gap, they found, would still be enormous today. Simply because of the compounding effect of the different starting points. And this is before accounting for the fact that the rates were not identical. That redlining, discrimination, and policy continued to slow black wealth accumulation for decades after the starting point gap was already established. The wealth gap between black and white Americans is nearly as large today as it was in the 1950s. Not because black Americans have not worked. Not because black Americans have not tried. Because compounding was working, in both directions, for a very long time. Chapter 4. The invisible headwinds. Now let us bring this into your life. Right now. Today. Because the history matters, but what matters most to you is what it means for the decisions you are making this year. There is a common belief that once the laws changed, the playing field leveled. The data does not support this. Headwind 1. Inheritance. White families are nearly 4 times more likely to receive an inheritance than black families. An inheritance, the silent transfer of wealth across generations, is one of the most powerful wealth-building mechanisms that exists. It is not income. It is not salary. It is a head start. Paid for by the generation before. That you did nothing to earn. Headwind 2. Higher income does not close the gap. This is perhaps the most important and least understood finding in the research. Even at higher income levels, even when black professionals earn the same salary as white colleagues, the racial wealth gap persists. Sometimes it widens. Because income is what you earned this month. Wealth is everything that was built before this month. Headwind 3. Employment vulnerability. The typical black worker is more likely to be displaced in any given year and suffers worse ongoing financial harm from experiencing unemployment than white workers. And black and Hispanic households are twice as sensitive to income shocks as white households. When you have no buffer, every shock hits harder. It is a cycle within the cycle. Headwind 4. Credit and property. Less access to credit. Higher interest rate on the credit that is available. Lower valuations of homes in predominantly black neighborhoods. Every one of these is a tax. Not a formal one. Not a written one. But a real one, paid every year. These are not excuses. These are headwinds. And you can move forward into a headwind. But only if you know it is there. Chapter 5. What this means for you right now. So what do you do with all of this? First, and most importantly, you stop. You stop the self-blame that was never accurate. If you have been working hard and still feeling behind, it was not because you were lazy. It was not because you made poor choices. It was not because you lacked discipline. You were running a race that started further back. And you were running it without knowing that. That is not a small thing to understand. That is not a minor reframe. It is the difference between a person who thinks they are failing and a person who understands they are succeeding under conditions that were designed to make success harder. Those two people build very differently. The first step, as the research itself says, to eliminating the wealth gap is a proper understanding of what has caused it. Misleading narratives about wealth creation need to be challenged and corrected. Not so that you can be angry. So that you can be accurate. You do not need the system to be fixed before you start building. The system may not be fixed in your lifetime. That is the honest answer. But within that reality, within that honest, clear-eyed understanding of the terrain, there is still ground to be gained. Still wealth to be built. Still a story to be written that the next generation inherits. And that building, done with full knowledge of the headwinds, is the most powerful thing you can do. Chapter 6. What actually closes the gap? The researchers who study this gap are not silent on solutions. The first, and most powerful, wealth builder for most families is still homeownership. Not because property is the only asset. But because a home is a forced savings mechanism, a leveraged asset, a source of equity that can be borrowed against, and something that can be passed down to the next generation. The second. Business ownership and equity. Research found that while housing equity increased for black households during recent years, corporate and business equity did not. And it is business equity that drives the upper end of wealth building. Income from employment builds a life. Equity in assets builds generational wealth. The third. Intergenerational transfers. Research shows that black and white families who intend to leave a sizable estate are similar in number. The intention is the same. The ability is different. This means that the work is not just to earn more this year. The work is to build something that survives you. A home, a business, a portfolio, an education fund. Every generation that builds changes the starting point of the next. The fourth. Financial literacy at a real level. Not budgeting tips. Not savings hacks. Understanding how compound growth works, how leverage works, how equity builds, how tax works in your favor when used correctly. Most of this knowledge was never taught in the schools that served the communities most affected by the wealth gap. That was not an accident. And closing that knowledge gap is one of the most powerful things you can do. Chapter 7. The close. Let me bring together everything across these 4 videos. In video 1, we talked about the scarcity mindset. How financial stress costs cognitive capacity. In video 2, we talked about emotional spending. How the dopamine loop hijacks financial decisions. In video 3, we talked about the black tax. How the one who made it out carries a weight that compounds against their own wealth building. And now, in video 4, we have zoomed all the way out to the structural picture, the historical architecture, the compounding of denial that began generations ago and is still running today. Every single one of these things is connected. They are not for separate problems. They are for layers of the same reality. And the person who understands all 4 layers builds with a clarity that most people never access. You are not behind because you failed. You are not behind because you are not trying. You are navigating a terrain that was made difficult, deliberately, architecturally, over generations. And you are doing it mostly without a map. This channel is the map. Not a complete one. No single channel could ever be that. But something real. Something honest. Something that names what is actually there so that you can navigate it with your eyes open. Subscribe to WealthRootMind. Because in the next video, we are going to talk about financial trauma. About the relationship with money that was formed before you ever had any. About the beliefs that were installed in childhood that are still running in the background of every financial decision you make today. That one will surprise you. The root of wealth is never money. It is always, always, the mind. We will see you in the next one.